Good evening and welcome to this webinar. My name is Alessio Patalano. I am reader in East Asian Warfare and Security at the Department of War Studies, King's College London, and a member of the Centre for Grand Strategy at the department. I also run the King's Japan program, and I am delighted tonight to welcome you all to one of our book launch series that we're doing this autumn. Today, I am particularly pleased to host Tobias Harris, whose recent book on Prime Minister Abe, The Iconoclast, not only will probably go down in history as the book with one of the coolest titles ever, but it also is one of the best timed books in history. I think the book probably came out on the same day that Prime Minister Abe stepped down, or roundabout, sort of like, depending on which time zone you were, the book would have been ready to be on your desk as soon as the man stepped down. So rarely any scholar would be more sort of envious of such a perfectly timed opportunity. But that says a lot about the book itself, which is absolutely compelling, not only in the argument, but in tracing in providing a very insightful and in-depth analysis of what is the longest prime minister in Japanese post-war history, but also a person that had been portrayed earlier on in his political career in a certain way. And the book does an excellent job at sort of providing depth, color, and nuances to a political experience and a personal journey that is absolutely remarkable in more ways than once. Tobias could be, few people would be more better placed than Tobias to have written about Abe, having direct and in-depth knowledge of the inside politics in the Japanese Diet, having been directly exposed there as a researcher for a Diet member in the mid-2000s, when the Japanese sort of political landscape was changing at a much faster rate than ever before. And since then, he's been a keen observer of how the political dynamics in Japan have changed. So in this respect, few people will probably be in a better position to provide a comprehensive and certainly engaging picture of this very consequential Prime Minister. Tobias, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Just a couple of very brief observations on the logistics. As usual, please use the chat or the Q&A space to ask your questions or submit comments. The session is designed in a way that Tobias will lay out the context for the book over the next 20 minutes or so. And then from there, we'll have a bit of a conversation and open sort of the ground for a much wider conversation with the rest of the audience listening. For those of you also following us live on Facebook, please by all means try to get in the questions you want to ask. This is very much an interactive section of the webinar, and in particular, given the topic, there's so many different ways we can talk about Prime Minister Abe and his political experience, and I'm truly looking forward to the conversation we will all be having together. Tobias, without any further ado, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Alessio, for that really gracious introduction. Thank you for having me here to the King's College, for hosting this. I'm really pleased to have the chance to talk today. Like Alessio said, I don't want to talk for too long because I've found that the thing about Abe is people love to talk about him, and that's part of the reason why I was drawn to telling his story. That there was it's almost the depths of him, the things about him. He's a fascinating character to discuss, really a fascinating person, a fascinating story to tell. There is something that stands out about him, being a third generation Diet member, the grandson of one of the most notorious figures of 20th century Japanese history, someone who Abe consciously learned from Kishi Nobusuke, the lessons that he learned from his father, Abe Shintaro, who was a notable foreign minister. So that you have this politician who comes into politics in 1993 with some really tremendous expectations, and then watching what he did with them, how he carved out a political identity, how he rose very rapidly to the premiership in 2006, and then experienced a rather a dramatic decline and fall in 2006, 2007, suffering failure, really learning how to fail for the first time in his life. I mean, it's something, just as part of the human part of telling his story. It was one of the things that I was most drawn to. Here was someone who, was an absolute political princeling, we might say in other contexts, who just sort of moved his way up, was helped along, had never really had to struggle. And of course, in 2007, then really learns what it means to in some ways to suffer in a very public way. And so part of what drew me to a story was just at a human level, how someone who could go through that kind of experience in 2007 somehow gets back up, dusts off his shoulders, and stays in politics, and then much faster than I think anyone had expected, finds his way back into the LDP's leadership and the premiership. And I just thought that was, when I was first thinking about wanting to write this book, I mean, just telling that story, how he came back, was a big part of what drew me to it. In the time that I have today to talk, though, I do want to really focus mostly on how to think about his legacy and the legacy of his time as Japan's longest prime minister. Longest serving prime minister. And what I want to emphasize is what I call the two sides of stability. Because any discussion of Abe's tenure starts with stability. The fact that although Japan had had a revolving door premiership in the 6 years before Abe came back in 2012, late 2012, with as many prime ministers in as many years, you did get this period to, I think, virtually everyone's surprised. I don't think anyone really expected in late 2012 that 8 years later we would be talking about Abe as Japan's longest serving prime minister. But Japan did get this period of remarkable stability. You had not just the same prime minister for that stretch of time, but you also had really the same leadership team. You had the same people around Abe for a profoundly long stretch of time. So Asao was the finance minister for that entire time. Suga was the chief cabinet secretary, and we're seeing some of the benefits of that. Someone who really was at the height of decision-making the Japanese government, now is prime minister after serving in that role. In a number of the key positions around the prime minister, you sort of had people moving between positions, but it was really the same faces in Abe's inner circle. So you really had at the highest levels of government for a really tremendous stretch of time, the same people gaining experience, working together, people who trusted each other, were loyal to Abe. It's hard to think of a period of time where Japan ever had anything like that. I mean, even Abe broke the record of his great uncle Sato Eisaku, but Sato was known for really changing his cabinets year in, year out, and really setting that as the practice during the LDP's tenure. This really was something new. I mean, really seeing at the top of the government the same leadership team, and it really, I think, had some really tremendous effects for Japan, particularly given that this period coincided with, I think, a dramatically turbulent decade, particularly in Japan's neighborhood. I mean, this was the decade, that saw the transition to Xi Jinping and the emergence, I think, of a much more assertive China on all sorts of dimensions. It saw, a period of I think, uncertainty about U.S. leadership in the world. The arrival of a lame duck Obama administration near the beginning of Abe's second tenure, and then the transition, of course, from Obama to Trump. Just general uncertainty about the health of the global economy. You're all in the UK. I mean, questions about the role of the UK and the European Union, and so this sense of the world was more unstable outside Japan's shores. And at that moment, you did get a profoundly stable government that really set Japan apart and enabled Japan, first and foremost, to play a leadership role in the world in a way that it hadn't before. And I think when we think about the positive side of the stable leadership that Abe brought, I mean, it really starts with foreign policy. I mean, I think from the beginning of his tenure, he made clear what he wanted to achieve in foreign policy. He said, that there's no alternative to the United States being present in the region militarily, politically, and economically. And he repeatedly invested political capital and ensuring that that was the case. So in March of 2013, he'd only been in power for a couple months at that point, makes the decision to bring Japan into TPP, despite the fact that he basically was elected on a majority, much of the LDP majority that brought him into power was actually had campaigned against TPP, because at that time the Noda government was well into talks to bring Japan in, but hadn't made the decision yet. And so many LDP members had actually campaigned against TPP. And yet, despite that, Abe makes the decision in March of 2013 that Japan is going to join, and joins not in a way that it had done before, but had done in a way where it was going to really be an active leader of the talks. It was going to shape the rules, because in many cases, despite the fact that a lot of attention was paid to the areas in which the United States and Japan disagreed, there were many areas in which the United States and Japan agreed and were able to work together to fashion what now is considered really the highest standard trade agreement in the world. That was something new. That was, Japan and the United States were going to work together to really push something through, and Abe was going to make sure that domestically opposition could be overcome. On security, you saw the same thing, a recognition that Japan had to really make some decisions to commit more to the alliance, to be able to do more in its alliance with the United States. So 2014, well, really starting in 2013, you got a new state secrets law that enabled Japan to protect privileged state information more than it ever had before. That was something the U.S. had wanted for some time to enable closer cooperation. In 2014, you had the reinterpretation of the Constitution, which opened the door to Japan at least contributing collective self-defense roles in the alliance, something it hadn't been able to do before, at least in some limited circumstances. 2015, Abe invested an extraordinary amount of political capital to change laws governing the self-defense forces to enable them to play the roles envisioned by the reinterpretation. So that you just saw at every step of the way, Abe, knowing that he was going to face domestic opposition, doing what he had to do to realize this vision of a stronger alliance with the United States, to ensure that the United States was still willing to come to Japan's defense, saw value in working with Japan to what ended up becoming, of course, the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. All of that, I think, was Abe articulating that role from the beginning. It wasn't just about the United States, though, and I think we can really see this thread really going through throughout his tenure and now into Suga's tenure. And that is, I think there was a realization from the beginning of Abe's tenure that the focus of competition with China in the region, it wasn't about changing China per se. There was never really a sense from the Abe government that they're going to change China. It was about how do we ensure that the countries of Southeast Asia in particular, the middle income countries, the future, kind of the growth powers of the future, how do you ensure that they're not dominated by China, that they're not so economically dependent on China that they lose their political independence? And there was a commitment really from the beginning of the Abe administration that Japan was going to do more to ensure the political independence of ASEAN and really countries along China's maritime periphery, essentially. And that commitment was expressed. It was Abe's first foreign trip in January of 2013 when he went to Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam, gave a big speech in Jakarta where he laid out this vision. And that speech doesn't refer to China at all. It made very clear that Japan recognized that competition with China really was it was focused on those countries and ensuring those countries' freedom of maneuver. And again, every step of the way in the subsequent 7, almost 8 years was focused on strengthening the political independence of those countries. And so you had a major ramping up of Japan's infrastructure investment in the region. And beyond that, articulating a set of principles, what became known as quality infrastructure investment, that made Japan an extremely attractive partner for these countries. And this, of course, started before China even articulated the Belt and Road Initiative. So oftentimes it's framed as Japan's response, but in many ways, Japan was doing this even before China started ramping up its own program. And if you look at the money that's actually been invested, Japan is there toe-to-toe with China in investing in these countries and remains an extremely attractive partner to these countries. You also saw, of course, maritime capacity building and strengthening their ability to fend off China's attempts to assert its maritime claims in the South China Sea. Of course, so there's a lot more work to do on that front, but it was something that Japan was taking quite seriously. You saw a series of investments in ties with what we now know as the Quad and building out the Quad. So, as we saw this week with Prime Minister Morrison in Japan, Japan's relationship with Australia, both economically and militarily, has reached levels that had never been reached before. Its relationship with India, another major priority for Abe, and that's something that's been going back for many years. That there was more economic investment, more political investment in strong ties with India, and more military to military relationships. I mean, all of that was the result of this vision that was articulated early on, and that because you had the same leadership, you got a firm commitment and ability to follow through on that. Part of that story, when we think about Abe's foreign policy legacy, is institutional, and that you did have a government that was committed to having the power to actually articulate this vision and then follow through on that. And so by the end of his first year, you had a National Security Council and a National Security Secretariat, you had a national security strategy in place, and you did see really the concentration of power in the Prime Minister's office for the Prime Minister able to conduct his own foreign policy in ways that hadn't really been possible before. And so, yes, of course, you have the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has plenty of ideas, but in many cases, on issue after issue, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was really doing the bidding of the Prime Minister in a way that you hadn't seen before. And I mean, this really is a tremendous legacy of the Prime Minister Abe's durability. The other area I think we can really look at as part of his legacy, it's really related to that last point where we saw the Prime Minister's power in foreign policy grow, and that is institutional and administrative reform, so that political control of all policymaking was concentrated in the Prime Minister's office much more than ever before. One of the most important reforms, and I quote an anonymous finance ministry official to this point in the book, is in 2014 when you got the creation of a cabinet personnel bureau. This was an idea that had been floating around for a while. Finally, you had a government that was committed to doing this and followed through and made the legislative changes needed, so that you now had the cabinet and in practice the Prime Minister's office able to make choices for who would fill the top 500, 600 slots across the bureaucracy. It would not be up to the ministries themselves, it would be up to the Prime Minister's office. And I think the impact of that was immediate. You really had throughout the bureaucracy, not just the people who were in line for these top positions, but anyone who wanted to move up in the ranks knew that they had to listen to the wishes of their political masters. That hasn't been all good. I mean, I think some of the scandals that Abe faced in his later years, when the word of the day was sontaku, and this idea that bureaucrats were trying to guess at what the Prime Minister wanted, those scandals, I think, were probably a consequence of the fact that the Prime Minister did have control over the bureaucratic appointments. But the fact that you did have political control, agenda-setting power, the ability to really make, to point the government in a direction and to actually follow through on that, that power had accumulated in the Prime Minister's office more than ever before. Of course, you did several decades of reforms that enabled that, but all the pieces fell into place during Abe's tenure in a way that you hadn't before. And really, the result was just this not just a long tenured government, but really a strong government, a government that had control of the bureaucracy, a government that had control of the LDP, that you had much more discipline of the LDP. You had far fewer instances where LDP backbenchers were undercutting the Prime Minister's wishes and intentions. Of course, towards the end, I think as Abe's power slipped, you saw more pushback from the backbenches. But the point is, for almost his entire tenure, that was the story of the Abe government. The Abe government was able to set a direction and follow through. I mean, we saw this on economic policy too. Abenomics was articulated before Abe actually became Prime Minister again. But this idea of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy and having stimulus on both fronts, genuine coordinated macroeconomic stimulus, followed up with, I wouldn't call it structural reform. Too many people have called it structural reform, but at least industrial policies, deregulation, just a broad mix of policies intended to improve productivity, get more people in the workforce, reversing the decline of the labor force, and also, of course, encouraging people. Part of it was pro-natalist, part of it was encouraging people to start families and having family-friendly policies in place. All of that were a result of the Prime Minister having more power, that you were able to pushed the Bank of Japan from the very beginning to take much more aggressive steps to combat deflation. That the government was able to overcome resistance to the finance ministry, not all the time. I mean, you still had 2 consumption tax hikes, but you also had 2 delayed consumption tax hikes. You had the prime minister able to set a more accommodative direction for fiscal policy consistently, and basically push efforts to get fiscal sustainability down. You push that down the road further and further. That was because of a strong prime minister. And the fact that there was as much experimentation, which is really the story of the so-called third arrow, the government was able to throw out different ideas and try them and see what sticked. I mean, there was, I think, a downside of that was that there was never enough attention and a sense of prioritization, that they kept trying different things and never really focused. But that wasn't because the prime minister didn't have the power, or because they were constantly being undermined. I think it was just a sense of maybe overactivity and hyperactivity that undermined the government itself. But that was not because the prime minister didn't have the power to set a direction. And that experimentation, that sense of experimentation, I think was very much a product of increased power. There is, I think, that I think is a good segue to what I think is the downside of stability. And I think the number one consequence of stability and the government's long tenure without really any serious political opposition was that I think over time Abe's goal morphed from, I think, aggressive changes to policy to stability for its own sake. And so I think when you look at the record, the Abe government's record, his first 2 terms as LDP leader from 2012 to 2018, you did see, I think, a lot of creativity, a lot of energy, a lot of activism, both on foreign policy and domestic policy, economic policy. And during his last 2 years in office, and really maybe even starting before then, the energy, I think, had faded. And I think there was a reluctance to take risks, I mean, certainly on economic policy, for fear of undermining the government's stability. I think there was a sense that, in part maybe because the world was dangerous, that the government did not want to take risks, did not want to pursue more aggressive reforms, for example, in economic policy or on climate policy, anything that might have resulted in significant pushback, say, from economic interests, because I think the government felt that staying in power was worthwhile for its own right. And I think that is the danger of a long tenure, that you become so determined to stay in power. And I think Abe, of course, wanted to set longevity records, wanted to stay in power, to bring, to open the Olympics, that there was, I think, a timidity that set in towards the later years of his government. I think the other, I think, flip side of Abe's stability is what it tells us about Japan's democracy. And the story, I think, of Abe's government is not a story of robust political mandates. I mean, I think, the story of Abe's elections, I mean, he won 6 elections as leader of the LDP. But what is notable about every one of those elections is that turnout fell in all of them. And so he was elected in 2012, brought the LDP back into power with a record low turnout of 59-something%. And then in 2014, when he called the snap election, turnout fell about 7 percentage points, and you had about 52% turnout, which was, of course, a dramatic new record low. And then again in 2017, when he also called the snap election, you had the second lowest election. So turnout bounced a little bit. And so at no point you really did not have, the public was not excited about voting for Abe. There was not really a sense that he was bringing voters out to vote for him. I think he basically depressed turnout. The opposition had nothing to offer the public, and so independents stayed home. And so there was a sense that Abe's support, the large majorities he won, were basically on the back of, whether you want to call it apathy, I don't know if apathy is the right word for it, but I think a sense of exhaustion. You had seen, I think, a tremendous amount of political competition during the first decade of this century. In 2005, you had massive turnout in the Koizumi postal privatization election. In 2009, when the Democratic Party of Japan won the biggest victory a post-war party had won. You also had extraordinarily high turnout. All of that reflected, I think, a real investment in the possibility of political change, and what sort of populist style leadership could deliver in Japan. And I think by the time Abe comes back in 2012, I think that that energy had exhausted itself. And so you did have a sense of the public was sort of content to sit back, allow Abe to govern. They were sort of not dissatisfied with stable government, not dissatisfied with a prime minister who actually was able to set out what he wanted to achieve, and at least use the power of his office to try to achieve it. But it was not something that really reflected robust political competition or vigorous support for his government. And I think that remains the case. And I think in some ways, the more dangerous the world has looked, the more unstable Asia has looked, the more that sense of complacency with a stable government has, I think, remained the dominant political trend in Japan right now. And I think it explains what we've seen with the Suga government. So before we go to questions, just a couple final words on whether we can say Abe succeeded or not. And, you know, it's not an easy question to answer because there are a couple of different ways to think about it. Because on the one hand, as I've discussed, I mean, I think he did have some real meaningful policy achievements that will outlast him. I think, you know, both in foreign policy and in economic policy. I mean, I don't think we can dismiss the fact that unemployment was at its lowest levels in several decades. Tax revenues rose to their highest levels since the bubble burst. You know, the unemployment figure, I think, is worth looking at in particular because it meant, you know, for several years, you didn't have a lost generation. You did not have people leaving school and not having jobs to join. You had people having opportunities that they hadn't had before. You know, that young people were employed and had their choice of employment in a way that they hadn't had in decades. That is a meaningful change and will make a meaningful difference for years to come in the lives of young Japanese. And it probably explains why the strongest support Abe received was actually from young Japanese, not from older Japanese. And that is, I think, a meaningful difference, and it is something that is a result of Abe's long tenure. However, I would say that by Abe's own desires and his own ambitions dating back to the beginning of his career and the iconoclastic ambitions, the desire to really realize something different and to really reverse Japan's fortunes and to lift some of the constraints that have led, I think, other countries to wonder what role Japan will play in the future. I think by that measure, I think he was not an unqualified success. I think Japan still faces significant demographic constraints because of you know, the pro-natalist policies that Abe pursued did not succeed. Last year, in fact, was one of the worst years on record, going back a long way when it comes to the number of births in Japan. Economically, the economy is growing, but of course, we're not anywhere near out of the woods as far as the pandemic is concerned, and what the economy looks like after the pandemic. For example, do the tourists come back? What does Japan's relationship with the region look like afterwards? And what will Japan be able to look to when it comes to growth after the pandemic? I mean, I think we're still figuring that out. Fiscally, I think Abe showed that you can live with quite a significant debt load without having to worry about a crisis. But eventually, some decision is going to have to be made about how to live with the debts that the Japanese government is carrying. And Abe basically succeeded at pushing that issue down the road instead of solving it once and for all. And Japan's relations with in the region, its relationship with the United States, there's not going to ever be really a final solution to any of this. These are going to be constantly managed. And I think that maybe is the ultimate legacy of Abe, that for the entirety of the Heisei period, the dream of the reformers had been Japan needed a strong prime minister who would overcome the challenges Japan faced in the post-bubble world, the post-Cold War world, once and for all, and that if you had strong leadership, those problems would be solved and that Japan could be a great power again. And I think the lesson ultimately of Abe's tenure is that even with the strongest leader Japan has had maybe ever, there's no solving these problems once and for all. Japan is going to constantly have to manage the search for new sources of growth. It's going to constantly have to manage its relationship with the United States at a time where the United States looks even more uncertain as a regional leader and a committed regional power in Asia. it's going to have to find a way to walk a tightrope with China, where it's going to have an economic relationship, but how do you balance that when there are legitimate security concerns about a stronger, wealthier China? Managing relations with the other countries in the region. All of this, none of this is ever going to be finished once and for all. And every one of his successors is going to continue to just have to keep these balls in the air and guide Japan through what's going to be a turbulent century. But the work is never going to be over. And that ultimately, I think, is the lesson of Abe's tenure. And I'm going to stop there, and went a little longer than I thought, but looking forward to a discussion with all of you.
Thank you, Tobias. Thank you very much. Honestly, I didn't even notice that you went for a little longer. I was there listening, it's like, oh yeah, I'm taking notes. So, we could go over and over this, all sorts of different sort of directions. I was thinking while you were talking that I would love to go on all the various sort of aspects you touched upon. Institutional reforms domestically. You talked about foreign policy, security matters. You talked about the centralizing of power and this question of legacy and how we understand the concept of legacy as a fundamental sort of starting point before assessing whether one can claim success or not. And I think the last point that you were making about showing to Japan that even with the strongest possible leader, certain problems are not going to go in the way. You will have to continuously sort of manage them. That is actually something that I hadn't thought about, and I think it's absolutely true. And perhaps you're absolutely right. It's something that, in my own experience with the younger officials in Japan, it's something that now it's starting to sort of percolate through the ranks, and people are getting used to the fact that this is a job that you don't do one off because you've got the right boss and you find a solution to it. You'll have to continue to do this job, and the content of it will continue to evolve because the variables, the balls in the air, are so many. I wanted to ask you two things. So I don't want to abuse my powers in this sense, but there's something because we have also a lot of students online. So I want to focus my questions less on the various threads and more on the story behind it. Because, of course, writing a biography of a serving prime minister, it must have been quite a challenging thing to do. And in university, we're always sort of engaging with our students on conversations about methodology and the sources that we use and how we get about. And of course, as you say, Abe's behavior, particularly the second time he came about with the reforms he introduced, raises a legitimate question about how, this idea that Kante was so central reinforces the point that what kind of sources you can rely on. Who can you speak to that is not going to tell you, oh, he's a great guy, he's the greatest guy ever, that sort of thing. So perhaps the first question, just if you could tell us a little bit more about your own journey and in navigating these. Honestly, I mean, as a Japan scholar, I find it very daunting to write about a contemporary person because I've done it. And I know that sometimes you have to stop and think, okay, am I totally biased on this because I've been inside the story so long that I lost track of things?
In some ways, it wasn't as hard as you might think, in part because there's so much that's been written about him in Japanese. And some of it was just, I'd read enough in Japanese about him and just thought, how is there not something, a biography in English? I mean, that just like, and particularly as his second tenure lengthened, it just seemed that here is a pretty consequential world leader. There's much written about him in the vernacular literature, and just starting by what are people saying about him in Japanese and finding, reading. I mean, behind me, I probably have several shelves of those books. I mean, and just trying to read as much, both, the hagiographies and then also sort of the more critical text. But I mean, the thing, and it just goes to show what the depths there are to him, because, there have been intellectual biographies written of him, and, what is Abeism and where, what is his place in post-war conservatism? I mean, that book has been written. And of course, some of it, one of my favorite chapters to write was the chapter about Keiichi and seeing, how to connect, because of course there've been lots of newspaper articles, about Keiichi's role, but, really digging in and finding the connections and figuring out, how that fits into his life. That was part of it too. And of course, there's been much written both in English and Japanese about Keiichi. so some of it was just reading the secondary literature. I did do interviews, talk to people here in DC, talk, to plenty of people in Tokyo, people in the Kante, people who know Abe, just trying to get as much granularity and to really fill in some of the details. I mean, and I had to cut a lot. I mean, I wrote, I had a contract to write 100,000 words. My first draft ended up being about 165,000 words. And so spent the better part of last year, like the second half of last year, just cutting and learning that there's always things to cut. So, there's a lot. It really was a challenge figuring out what absolutely was essential and had to be told. And part of it was also, I felt that like I was able to tackle the book because, just from my day job, I'd been covering kind of the day-to-day ins and outs for so long and had a sense of the sort of different narrative threads. And so it was just, in that way, it actually made the writing easier, that it took, like I've been looking at Abe and reading about Abe for so long. And so I kind of knew the backstory. I'd read those books. And I also had a sense of kind of the plot lines of his second government. And it was easy enough to put those two together. So in that way, it wasn't actually as hard as you would think. It really, it was really just figuring out what was most important and what to prioritize. And that, that in some ways was the biggest challenge, that there's so much material to go through. There's so much that could be included, and just figuring out how to triage was the challenge.
In this respect, I couldn't agree more with you. One of the things I always find fascinating every time I'm in Japan is that as soon as first of all, there's still sort of this old-fashioned thing about bookshops that they just attract, and I love it. It's one of the reasons why I spend an awful lot of time, and I've got bookshops in Tokyo that I love. I always go there as my first port of call, just because they're familiar and there's this overwhelming attraction that comes across. But you're absolutely right. You spend half an hour in there, and you look in your little basket, and you've got 50 books. It's like, no, this is not going to work.
I feel like every one of us does that. Every Japan scholar. And that's actually, it's kind of killing me that it's now been, I haven't been back to Japan since February of last year. And of course, so I will go there and I will come back and I basically will fill a suitcase with books. And I've been doing that for years. I was going on research trips and came back and over time just accumulated enough material. And now I've I'm trying to find workarounds in Kinokuniya USA.
I know, but it's not the same.
It's not the same, because you have to go and you have to see. And also you learn, what I find, I think as a researcher, the thing that you learn from going, being in the bookshops, seeing what is prominently displayed, you learn, I think it gives you such a sense of the zeitgeist. Like there was a period of, I think this is actually a perfect illustration of, what I was talking about, where I think from 2016 onwards, sort of an appreciation of just how dangerous the world was starting to appear outside of Japan. All of a sudden you started seeing every book had like geopolitical risk in the title. And you walk into like Maruzen or Kinokuniya and, there'd be like a shelf and every book was about geopolitical risk. And I think for me, that was just like there's I think the sort of undercurrent of we're in a dangerous time.
No, absolutely. I remember in this respect, and then we've got lots of questions are coming in, but one small thing, that and sort of reading newspapers on a daily basis always been, particularly the paper, the hard copy, because you got a sense that, back in the early 2000s, you'd see like defense and security in Northeast Asia coming up on front page as it would have never been the case previously, now and then. And then, say, for example, you've got North Korean missiles, and then it goes to the front page. And then the following day, postal reform is back on the front page, and it stays on the front page for a week. Whereas by the time that the early 2010 are settling in, you've got the defense and security matters, for example, are almost permanent feature on the mainstream debate. And again, the visual engagement on what people really are worried about, what are they looking at, it really is an important thing. And before we go to the 100 questions that we've got there, one quick thing, because you mentioned it and I had it in the back of the mind and I was biting my lips. I didn't want to ask, but I have to, because the Kishi story, and of course the Keiichiro Abe story is one of the things that's been particularly interesting to look at in terms of where do you draw a distinction between a family connection and then what it becomes a political platform and the political agenda. And you mentioned, of course, Australia and India as two very important sort of examples of how the Abe imprint on foreign policy sort of changes things. And to me, India stands out as one of those places where there is a clear link with his family history and personal story. And I wonder whether that is actually that's something that you felt in your research, whether you would say, yes, there is one of those moments where family history and political platforms sort of like overlap and converge.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually in some ways the even bigger than that. I mean, what I thought was most interesting about the Keiichi Abe story is that, sometimes it's often told as if it were inevitable, that, okay, Abe is Keishi's grandson, of course he's going to do this. But what I found most interesting was that until he was elected to the Diet, it's not like there are stories about him being like a young rightist in university. He wasn't, he was, all the stories about him talking about politics, and he tells some of these stories himself. They're more about, like, literally he's just defending his family, and it's not because he had deeply held convictions or he was a very close observer of what Keiichi had done. Of course he was 6 years old when Keiichi was prime minister, so it's not like he had especially deep thoughts at that time. But it wasn't like when he was a young man and starting to learn about politics that he was so attached to Keishi's vision. And it's amazing how much it was a matter of choice. And I think that, that there was a self-conscious effort when Abe was a young Diet member to become Keishi's heir. That he, and this is, when you look at the number of hereditary politicians that Japan has, this is not something that every hereditary politician does. That, that they don't always feel the same attraction to their forebears. And, frankly, his father had different politics than Keiichi. So if Abe had said, I'm going to follow my father, that would have been a choice too. Or he could have said, my father's father, who I never knew, was notable for being an anti-war Diet member. And, I'm so, that I'm so inspired by that example. I mean, there were so many different paths he could have taken. And so it was not inevitable that he was, that Abe was going to be Keishi's heir. I mean, I think you can look at the influence of his mother. I think the fact that his mother, Keishi's daughter, played such an outsized role in his life. I mean, I think that was definitely a factor in it. But I mean, I think the fact that Abe rebelled against his father and was drawn towards his grandfather is part of Abe's self-invention and the creation of his political personality. And so that I think is one of the most fascinating things about his career and his identity as a politician, that he chose this path. That he decided to become Keishi's heir, not that it was inevitable. And I just want to stress that, and I think it was one of the more interesting threads that I found in the course of writing.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Now, I've seen. I was sort of like starting to get a sense of the question, and obviously there are questions about the legacy, which I will sort of get back to in a minute. So these were the first questions to come in. So I apologize for those who were writing them. I'll come back to this in a minute because there's a couple of other questions that address some of the points that we've already touched. One, of course, that springs to mind is about the end game. So when we're looking at foreign policy, of course, you were talking about the considerable amount of success that you can look across the board. But of course, there are also some areas where success is much more complicated to assess. Certainly when it comes to China, South Korea, what was the end game there? Did he have a plan to begin with? Do you feel that that plan changed and then simply gave up? I would probably throw Russia into that, because if there's one area that is like low point, that's Russia. But China and South Korea are both very interesting because they start in two different places and end up almost reversing each other. What do you think in that sense we should look at the process there?
I feel like we could probably spend the remainder of our time talking about.
I know. So I mean,
probably the remainder of our time talking about South Korea. I mean, because the arc of it is so complicated. It all. I mean, it really does all. I mean, it's all about Japan's security ultimately, right? And what doing whatever it takes to ensure that Japan Japan's position in its region is secure. And I think so. The arc of relations with China, I think, it bears remembering that Abe came back, when there was a real genuine crisis between Japan and China as the Noda government moved to nationalize the Senkakus. Before that, you had the collision in the East China Sea between a Chinese fishing boat and the Japanese Coast Guard. And he was an extremely outspoken critic of the DPJ for being soft on China. And so I think the first couple of years, I think, were spent. I mean, maybe we can just think of it as shoring up deterrence in the East China Sea, and showing that Japan was going to be strong and wasn't going to be pushed around. And some of that was what we might call internal balancing, right? Strengthening Japan's military, increasing defense spending, shifting Japan's defense, the self-defense forces to the southwest. So all of that was also alliance politics, and so strengthening ties with the United States, getting a guarantee from Obama about Article 5 of the Security Treaty. And I think there was a sense that once that was established, then you could move on towards, okay, how do we then stabilize relations with China? We're confident that we can deter China from provocation in the East China Sea or attempting to seize the islands one way or the other. But there's pressure from the business community to ensure that trade and investment and person-to-person flows all are able to proceed. And of course, it also reflects the influence of METI within the Abe government, and also, I mean, the last part is, it's not a coincidence that it really took off post 2016. That it was also, I think, a response to U.S. protectionism. Both, Beijing, I think, saw Japan as a suitable partner and a desirable partner as it faced a trade war with the United States. And I think on Abe's part, I think hedging against the possibility of trade friction with the United States, which was a real possibility over the last several years, and also the fact that there really was, I think, a need to reiterate the importance of kind of rule-based trading system and looking at China as a potential partner for that. There are other reasons for it, but I think that really explains the arc. And so there was a real sense of wanting to at least compartmentalize the security competition. I don't think there's been any de-emphasization of the security competition, and certainly I think the defense establishment has continued to highlight the dangers of China's military power. But I think keeping setting that aside, having talks on the economic side, and of course that was why we ended up getting Abe to Beijing in 2018. All of that I think explains why you ended up having that process. On the South Korean side, of course, during the early part, you did have, thanks in part to U.S. involvement, I think a real breakthrough in cooperation between the PAC government and the Abe administration, and resulting in a 2015 agreement on the comfort women. I mean, I think at the time, I noted at the time that it was remarkable to get that kind of commitment out of Abe, given his history with the issue, and I wrote something at the time warning that if the South Koreans did not stick to it, that if they backed away, they weren't going to get a better deal out of Japan, and they certainly weren't going to get a better deal out of Abe, and that there would be real risks, that you would have actually the situation where you have now, where the Japanese government doesn't trust the South Koreans. They're reluctant to make a deal because they don't really believe that the South Korean government's going to stick to it, and so you have had a point where from 2017 onward, you did get a progressive Korean government. They did back out of the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement. You've had people around President Moon who've talked about really wanting to kind of break away from the 1965 treaty, and you understand that. I mean, you look at how South Korea has changed. It was a very different country in 1965. You can understand that. I think from a South Korean perspective, it feels a little like an unequal treaty, and that does deserve to be upgraded. That the government at the time was weaker and poorer and not democratic. But you also understand the Japanese government's position that it is a treaty, and there are mechanisms as part of that treaty for dealing with issues, and so you understand the opposition to the court cases about forced labor and asset seizures. I mean, all of that is you understand where both sides are coming from. But I think the result of that is that post 2017. I think you have in the Japanese government a sense that there aren't really shared interests with South Korea. And I think that, that there are differences in China on how the South Korean government views China. There are differences in how the South Korean government views North Korea. The South Korean government has said that they don't want any part of the free and open Indo-Pacific. They don't really see cooperation with the Quad as a priority. And I think all of that has, led to strategic drift between South Korea and Japan. As we speak, there's, I think, an effort. The South Koreans, I think, are trying to fix that and are trying to achieve a breakthrough. I'm not sure that the Japanese government under Suga is prepared to make the kind of compromises that would reverse that strategic drift. And I think to the extent that Abe is at fault, I think it's really a lack of imagination and really seeing that Japan is not secure if it can't find a way to get along with South Korea, that if it can't find a way to work with a fellow US ally, wealthy democracy right next door, that is not going to leave Japan more secure. And so just, the fact that he showed so much creativity and willingness to imagine other possibilities in other parts of foreign policy, but to not be able to do that with South Korea is, I think, disappointing.
I couldn't agree more. I think that there is a little bit of that, but I also agree with you that at the moment my impression is that the Japanese government is not in the right place to consider sort of like a significant change in the direction of travel in that relationship. So I wanted to sort of take together a couple of questions that are about his personality, and sort of like one in particular sort of is about personality. The other one goes back to a point you mentioned earlier about the nature of his success. Personality-wise, to what extent do you think that his health condition on one hand and his sort of the characteristics as a nationalist politician, at least as it was portrayed at the very early stages of his career from the outside, to what extent do these two factors played a role in the way he approached important policy questions, perhaps chiefly among all of them, China on the one hand, but also his ability to communicate effectively within the government circles. That's one. And the other one that I think is also quite interesting is to what extent one of the key sources of his success was also the ability to reduce the power of effective opposition in Japan. To what extent, or is just the fact that opposition parties were not capable of organizing themselves and propose an alternative vis-a-vis the sort of the agenda that Abe was proposing? So on one hand, a slightly more personal note, on the other, sort of political mechanics. Is this about really success, or about sort of also dismantling your opposition's capacity to come after you in that sense?
Okay, you froze a bit there. So to the first one, I think my speculation. And this is speculative because I don't even know if Abe could answer this himself. But I do think not just his health condition. I think this is something he's lived with his entire basically his entire life. But also his father dying young, his grandfather on his father's side died young. I do think there's a sense of frailty, and I think it explains his ambitiousness, his to quote Hamilton, which I listened to a lot when I was writing this book, that he was running out of time, and watching what happened to his father, particularly watching his father because he was working closely. He was his father's secretary at the time that he got cancer, and then watching that ailment and falling short of the premiership. I do think there was a sense throughout his career that he couldn't afford, he couldn't wait. So he was constantly, and he paid a price for that because he was constantly being moved up to positions that he really wasn't quite ready for. And I write about this in the book, becoming the LDP Secretary General under Koizumi in 2003. He did not really have the kind of resume that most LDP secretaries general have. At the same time, 2005 becomes a chief cabinet secretary, maybe a little more appropriate, but still not, hadn't really developed the heft I think, appropriate to that role, and then becoming prime minister in 2006 for the same reason, like really and I think he knew. And one of the things that's interesting is when he after he resigns and he's in the wilderness, he recognized that. I think he knew that he allowed himself to be sort of swept into power and swept along by his allies who wanted him to become prime minister. And I think he knew at some level that he wasn't ready for it, that he needed to have some other cabinet post, that he needed more seasoning. And so I think there was a sense of his mortality, his physical frailty, kind of casting a shadow over his career and maybe allowing himself to get swept along with that. And I think it probably also shaped a second government, that, who knew, of course, part of his ability to come back was convincing the public, that he had a new regimen for managing his health, and he had a new drug to take that was working. But I do wonder if some of his, his hyperactivity during his second government was the sense that was, who knows how long his body was going to hold out. So it was a constant factor. In terms of his ideology, his conservatism or nationalism, I think part of the reason that I really start by telling the story of his family and the dynasty that he comes from, is that the post Cold War. I think he's elected in 1993 for the first time, and I think there was a sense of the every pillar of the post-war regime was vulnerable at that point. The bubble had burst, and the Japanese economic model looked at an end. The LDP lost power for the first time in 1993, and in a sense of the kind of Yoshida compromises were at an end. And of course, the end of the Cold War, were a blow to this idea that Japan should be a subordinate member of the U.S.-led free world. And there were new possibilities, and I think that really is where his conservatism came in. It was this, what I call in the book, the new conservatives. Not that their ideas were necessarily new, but I think they looked at the landscape in the post-bubble, post-Cold War, post-LDP hegemony world, and they saw possibilities for policies that had been foreclosed for decades. And that was, and it makes sense that Abe, as the heir of Keiichi, was able to be the leader of this group. That he had, the best claim to being the heir to the dynasty that had been pushing for this vision of Japan since the occupation ended, if not before, and that this was finally their opportunity to push that forward. And I think that is just such a fundamental part of the story of his rise to power, and doesn't explain everything. And one of the things one of the biggest threads of the book is the extent to which even as Abe was forging this political identity as a conservative ideologue, he was also thinking about how do you balance that with the realities of political power and getting things done. And I cite Weber. Abe cites Weber, so I cite Weber. I mean, Abe is a first-term Diet member reading Max Weber and talking about the balance between the heart and the head, and how you strike that balance is also a running theme in his career. The second question about the opposition, and I realize we're coming hard up to 2 o'clock my time. I tried to tell the story of this entire political era. So it's about Abe, but it's also about what's been a really just fascinating period of Japanese history, which has included really the for a time at least, genuine two-party competition. For the first time, quite possibly ever. Certainly in the post-war period, where you really had culminating in 2009 with the DPJ winning and an orderly change of power as the result of an election, something that hadn't happened during the post-war period. And so it's the story of the emergence of that two-party system, from the creation of the DPJ in the late 90s through the early 2000s, and the DPJ's emergence as a credible alternative to the LDP. But then Abe's story post-2012 is the story of the DPJ losing its credibility with the public. And that the DPJ that lost power in 2012 had essentially forfeited the trust of the public. So it spent a decade gaining the public's trust to the point where people were willing to vote it into power, and as a result of its 3 years in power, entirely losing the public's trust. And through the Abe years, failing to regain the public's trust. And I think up to this very moment, the opposition has not done that. It has not convinced the public that it can be trusted with power again. And that explains the low turnout in election after election. Some of that is Abe. I mean, Abe was quite successful at stealing policy ideas from the opposition, or just limiting their ability to compete with the LDP on the basis of policy. But some of it is just that no one really sees the opposition as credible after time. People remember what it was like in power. They see the same faces, and the opposition has just not helped itself by changing names, by kind of shuffling, combining and breaking, and none of that has, I think, convinced the public that the opposition is ready to govern again.
Tobias, I want to try to wrap this up over the next 5 minutes, and we've got quite a few questions. So what I'll do, I want to go, I'll have to apologize to a couple of people who sent in last minute questions that are very relevant, but in part you answer that. But I want to focus on two aspects of the conversation over Abe. One is this question of perception of stability in Japan, because one of our students, who's a young Japanese, she says that she actually, politically, she got interested in politics in Japan under the period when Abe was already in power. And so going back to the point you were making about Japanese youth and the perception of stability that they have, which mostly in their political sort of interests time really reflects the period of time that Abe has been in government. To what extent that will affect the expectation they might hold vis-a-vis Suga and the political sort of journey of Japan as we move forward. That's one thing. And I think it's a very interesting question, because we've been looking at these things for a very long period of time, obviously. So we knew Japan politically before Abe came about, but I think it's quite important to emphasize the point you were making about the link between the Japanese youth and the political stability and what it means to them, but also what kind of expectations it creates. Now, on the other hand, the other point I wanted to touch upon is the question of legacy. And here there were a couple of very interesting questions about Suga, and to what extent Suga represents sort of like the ideal heir to Abe's political journey, because he's been there since the beginning. I mean, if Abe had skeletons, Suga knows where they're buried. That's one of those things. But on top of that, he seems to be a very different type of politician when we compare it to Abe. And so in this respect, to what extent is a natural heir to the Abe sort of political journey, and in particular in foreign and security policy, to what extent you think he will have the sort of like energy that Abe has had in terms of steering the direction of the US-Japan alliance, of Japan diversification in the behavior and foreign policy, and so on and so forth. So two questions: one, stability and expectations it creates, and the other one, Suga and sort of like the legacy as it's been handed over to a new prime minister that is very close politically to Abe, but at the same time is also a very different person. And
sort of, those are all kind of two sides of the same question in some ways, because it really is thinking about how we should think about Suga in relation to Abe's legacy. I think I'm probably speaking for a lot of Japan watchers that we were maybe a little surprised by the ease with which Suga was able to succeed Abe. I mean, I think, and I think we're entirely justified. I mean, if you look at polls, if you look as recently as July, when in polls asking who people thought should be the next prime minister, I mean, Suga was polling at like 3%, and those polls aren't necessarily predictive per se, but they did. I think they did reveal the extent to which Suga, I think, up until the very last minute, had been an afterthought in the race to succeed Abe. And maybe if Abe had actually lasted until next year when his term was supposed to end, that maybe Suga doesn't enter that race at all, and maybe it is just a function of the fact that it was had come up suddenly, and he was basically he I think secured a first mover advantage and had an unusual amount of kind of hidden latent strength that he was able to use to win that race. But but the fact that he is older, the fact that he has not necessarily been in a, I mean, yes, it's a visible role because as chief cabinet secretary, he was giving press conferences twice a day, but not necessarily the most public role. Not a role. He was playing a part that I think involved, in many ways, subsuming his personality in the role. He was serving the prime minister. He was not out there selling in the way that maybe like. Koizumi Shinzo is out there selling, environmental policy. This is not what Suga was doing for 8 years.
No.
It was really an inside role. It was about controlling the bureaucracy, setting the policy agenda, making sure that the decision stuck. So I think all of that led, I mean, certainly speaking for myself, I mean, to take his chances for granted to a certain extent. But I think what Suga does benefit from is that desire for stability, and the fact that the public has, I think, come to appreciate the stability that Abe brought. And the best example for me is that Abe from 2017 onward constantly dealing with scandals, and scandals where the public had basically concluded that Abe was not telling the truth. They did not buy the explanations he was giving. And yet it was not until this year with the pandemic that his approval ratings really fell much below 50%. He had held, not only did his approval ratings hold up for the better part of 3 years, he also won a general election victory in 2017 with these two scandals hanging over his head. And it really just goes to show the extent to which the public really valued a stable, steady hand on the tiller. And I think to the extent to which Suga, both having been a key decision maker through the Abe years, and being committed to continuity, and being a capable leader in his own right, was able to grasp that and benefit from that. And so, in some ways, we shouldn't be surprised. And actually, I during the period between the time where it looked like he was the inevitable winner and then he was elected and became prime minister, there was a lot of discussion about, can he last, and is this going to be a return to revolving doors? I've actually been pretty bullish about his ability to win a term in his own right next year and maybe to last. I mean, I don't think he's going to break Abe's record, but I don't think we're going to see a 1-year premiership with Suga. I actually think because the public desires stability, I think that gives him a lot of leeway. We've already seen him weather one controversy, with the Science Council. I think his numbers have been barely dented after coming into power with among the highest approval ratings any prime minister has. And I think it really does come to the public's appetite for stability and not change. They don't want to see a turbulent LDP governance again. They certainly aren't flocking to the opposition. The opposition, I think, is despite another merger, is still struggling to rally the public. And so I think that really explains what we're seeing and what we've seen in the handoff from Abe to Suga, that Suga is able to kind of pick off right where Abe left off because the public wanted the government to pick off right where Abe left off. I don't know if I answered that question entirely, or if there were
no. I think you did, and I couldn't agree more. And I think adding on top of that, his first visit overseas was a resounding success, and everybody was stunned by his ability to manage the relationship, to offer speeches that actually added and built on that on the project that Abe had brought about. So it seems to me that domestically as well as in foreign policy, we might actually be looking at someone that, because he knows the folder so well, he will be able to make it his own and sort of build a sort of an element of greater longevity and stability for this legacy, given where he started. Listen, this has been absolutely terrific. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for also the depth and knowledge and the sheer passion in sharing all that you've sort of learned over the years. That's been truly remarkable and absolutely fascinating. I'm just sorry that we have to stop here.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, honestly, we could go on hours and we're just fine. In this respect, I want to apologize to the 2-3 people that were waiting on the list for the questions, and I didn't manage to get it through. But I hope that you will agree with me that this was a much enjoyable and absolutely fascinating sort of review of these critical years in which Japan under Abe has gone from a country that was fading away from the horizon of international affairs to one that is in the very center of the most dynamic region in the world. on this happy note, wish you all the best with the sales of the book. And indeed, we're looking forward to reading more of your work in months and years to come. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. And again, we'll see you soon over the next few weeks for a few other events lined up. Follow us on Twitter or through the Department of War Studies, or sign up for our newsletter with the Center for Grand Strategy and the King's Japan program. Thank you very much. And good afternoon if you are on the East Coast, and good evening for everybody else here in Europe. Thank you. Bye.